Picture this moment carefully, because it truly happened, and history later tried to bury it. It is the year 1608, deep inside the Vatican, at the political heart of Catholic Europe. Marble statues line the corridors, and Renaissance frescoes watch silently from vaulted ceilings. Walking through these halls is a black African man wearing silk robes stitched with gold thread. He is not a servant. He is not property. He is not there to beg. He's an ambassador, sent by an African king, carrying sovereign authority. He is about to meet the Pope as a diplomatic equal. His name is Dom António Manuel, and his presence alone dismantles Europe's favorite lie. Every step he takes challenges the story Europeans needed Africa to represent. This single moment exposes a truth Europe desperately tried to erase afterward. Africa was never outside global diplomacy, power, or civilization. And here's the part history avoids admitting openly. This was not an isolated exception or a symbolic gesture. For nearly 2 centuries, black African ambassadors entered European courts as recognized diplomats. They negotiated treaties, exchanged gifts, dined with royalty, and spoke in the language of power. They did this while Europe publicly described Africa as savage, primitive, and subhuman. When those contradictions became inconvenient, Europe erased the evidence instead. To understand how shocking this truly was, we need to rewind carefully and precisely. We are going back to the late 15th century through the early 17th century. This is the exact era when the Atlantic slave trade was being engineered. Ships were redesigned specifically to transport chained human beings across oceans. Legal systems were rewritten to justify permanent human captivity. Theological arguments were twisted to excuse violence against fellow Christians. For this system to survive, Europe needed a moral alibi. Africans had to be described as uncivilized and incapable of sovereignty. They had to be portrayed as people without culture, governance, or meaningful social order. Anything else would expose the trade as organized theft on a continental scale. But south of the equator, reality refused to cooperate with that story. There existed a powerful, centralized African state called the Kingdom of Kongo. Its territory covered parts of present-day northern Angola and the Congo Basin. This was not a loose tribal region or temporary coalition. It was a structured kingdom governing between 2 and 3 million people. Kongo had a central monarch, supported by provincial administrators. It operated taxation systems and maintained formal diplomatic protocols. It had long-distance trade networks reaching across Central Africa. Its people produced textiles, metal goods, agricultural surpluses, and ceremonial art. Its cities contained courts, archives, and royal lineages with generational continuity. This kingdom did not emerge because Europeans arrived. It already existed long before European ships appeared on its coast. In 1491, Portuguese explorers made formal contact with Congo's leadership. At that moment, the Portuguese lacked the military capacity to impose domination. What followed was not conquest or forced submission. It was a negotiation between 2 political entities, testing mutual advantage. The ruling king, Nzinga Ankuwo, made a strategic decision. He converted to Christianity and accepted baptism willingly. This choice was not submission, but calculation. Christianity offered diplomatic access to European monarchs and institutions. After baptism, he took the Christian name João I, his son, who would later rule as Afonso I, received an extensive European education. Afonso learned Portuguese fluently and studied Christian theology deeply. He understood European political customs better than many Europeans did. This created something unprecedented in European awareness, an African Christian kingdom capable of direct diplomatic engagement. King Afonso I did not write letters pleading for charity. He wrote letters as one sovereign addressing another sovereign. He expected agreements to be honored and laws to be respected. For a brief period, Europe responded accordingly. Trade agreements were signed. Diplomatic recognition was exchanged. Christian brotherhood was publicly acknowledged. Then profit intervened. Portuguese merchants discovered something more lucrative than copper or ivory. Human beings produced faster and more reliable wealth. By the early 16th century, slave raiding escalated rapidly. Kidnappings spread beyond warfare into systematic civilian capture. King Afonso watched his kingdom being hollowed from the inside. Entire communities vanished into coastal prisons. Noble families lost children to illegal trafficking networks. The authority of the crown itself was undermined. In 1526, Afonso wrote one of the most important letters in African history. He addressed King João III of Portugal in fluent Portuguese. He described merchants seizing free citizens, nobles, and royal relatives. He demanded enforcement of existing diplomatic agreements. This was not a rebellion. It was a lawful protest between allied monarchs. Portugal ignored him. The profits were too valuable. Moral responsibility became an inconvenience. But Congo did not surrender its voice. If letters were ignored, physical presence would replace ink. African kings began sending ambassadors directly to Europe. They traveled to Portugal, Spain, the Vatican, and northern courts. They forced European leaders to confront African humanity face to face. These journeys were lethal. Atlantic crossings took months under brutal conditions. Ships frequently sank or vanished without explanation. Disease killed diplomats before they reached land. Some deaths were suspiciously convenient for European interests. Yet the missions continued. Dom António Manuel was one of those envoys. He was selected by King Álvaro II of Congo. Years were spent preparing him for European diplomacy. He learned Latin and refined his Portuguese fluency. He studied court etiquette, religious law, and diplomatic protocol. He carried gifts suitable for sovereign exchange: ivory carvings, luxury textiles, and sealed royal letters. Traveled with him. His mission had a singular purpose: appeal directly to the Pope's moral authority. In Ilolingse, António Manuel began his journey. The voyage nearly killed him. Many diplomatic missions never arrived at all. But he survived long enough to reach Rome. When he entered the city in 1608, witnesses were stunned. He did not arrive in chains or under supervision. He arrived as a formal envoy with recognized credentials. Crowds gathered because their worldview had no category for him. Portuguese officials attempted to discredit him immediately. They questioned his status and denied Congo's legitimacy. But documentation defeated denial. António Manuel's authority was unquestionable. Pope Paul V received him as a fellow Christian diplomat, not as charity, not as a spectacle, as an ambassador of a sovereign kingdom. António presented his case clearly and calmly. He described the devastation of illegal slave raiding. He appealed to Christian law, not emotion. The Pope listened. For a brief moment, history balanced on possibility. António Manuel never returned home. He died in Rome later that year, officially from illness. The Pope issued limited condemnations afterward, but moral statements could not overpower economic addiction. The slave trade continued, and still, African ambassadors kept coming. In 1643, Dom Miguel de Castro traveled to the Netherlands and Brazil. He represented King Garcia II of Congo with equal authority. Dutch artists painted formal portraits of him during his stay. These images survive today in European museums. They depict a dignified black man in aristocratic dress. There are no caricatures, no mockery, only respect consistent with European nobility. Dom Miguel negotiated trade agreements and impressed foreign officials deeply. Contemporary records praised his intelligence and composure. Europe knew exactly who these men were. And then Europe chose to forget. Between 1485 and 1670, over 40 diplomatic missions left Congo for Europe. 40 documented journeys that contradict the mythology of African inferiority. African nobles lived in Europe for extended periods. Some studied at universities. Some resided within diplomatic courts. Some served as permanent representatives. The evidence never disappeared, even when the story was deliberately pushed into silence. The Vatican archives still contain thousands of pages exchanged between Congolese kings and European powers. Portuguese royal records preserve entire sections dedicated to diplomatic relations with the Kingdom of Kongo. European artists painted African ambassadors with care, realism, and unmistakable respect. European chroniclers wrote detailed descriptions of these encounters in official court histories. None of this was hidden during the period itself. It was known, discussed, documented, and filed by the people living through it. So the real question is not whether this history existed. The real question is how it vanished from public memory so completely. The answer is not accidental, and it is not complicated. By the late 17th century, the Atlantic slave trade had become staggeringly profitable. Entire European economies were now tied directly to forced African labor. Plantations, shipping companies, banks, insurers, and royal treasuries depended on it. For that system to survive, it required more than ships and chains. It required a story that made the violence feel acceptable. Africans had to be portrayed as people without civilization or political sophistication. Africa itself had to be described as a place without history or legitimate governance. Within that narrative, enslavement could be framed as improvement. Contact with Europe could be presented as salvation rather than exploitation. The brutality of the system depended on Africans being imagined as lesser beings. The Kingdom of Kongo shattered that narrative beyond repair. Its kings wrote in fluent Portuguese, using Christian legal frameworks. Its ambassadors followed European court etiquette flawlessly. Its diplomats negotiated treaties using the same language of sovereignty as European monarchs. You cannot argue Africans lacked civilization while storing African diplomatic correspondence in royal archives. You cannot claim Africa had no history while preserving 2 centuries of political documentation. You cannot call Africans savages while displaying their ambassadors' portraits in European palaces. The contradiction was too dangerous to acknowledge publicly. So, European powers made a decision that shaped centuries of historical understanding. They chose profit over truth. They chose the slave trade over a diplomatic partnership. They chose silence over honesty. Portugal led this erasure because it benefited the most directly, but other European states followed the same pattern. The history was not destroyed. It was buried under selective memory. By the early 18th century, Enlightenment philosophers began writing about Africa. They spoke confidently, despite rarely visiting the continent themselves. Thinkers like David Hume suggested Africans were naturally inferior. Georg, Wilhelm, Friedrich, Hegel declared Africa outside of history altogether. These men were not ignorant in the literal sense. They had access to libraries, archives, and diplomatic records. They could have read King Afonso, the First's letters word for word. They could have seen the portraits of Dom Miguel da Castro. Acknowledging that evidence would have undermined their philosophical arguments. It would have complicated moral justifications for slavery and colonial expansion. So instead, they wrote as if none of it had ever happened. This selective blindness became institutionalized knowledge. By the 19th century, it had shaped how Europe understood Africa entirely. When European explorers pushed deeper into the continent, they expressed public astonishment. They described discovering cities, kingdoms, and political systems with theatrical surprise. Those reactions were performances, not revelations. European governments already knew African states had existed for centuries. Their own archives proved it beyond any reasonable doubt. The shock narrative served only one purpose. It justified conquest by pretending Africa was previously unknown and undeveloped. Colonization could be framed as discovery instead of invasion. Violence could be portrayed as progress rather than destruction. Meanwhile, the Kingdom of Kongo was being slowly dismantled. Its collapse did not come from internal collapse or incompetence. It came from relentless external pressure and destabilization. Slave raiding drained its population continuously over generations. Portuguese territorial ambitions eroded its sovereignty piece by piece. Political interference weakened royal authority from the outside. By the 19th century, the kingdom was broken beyond recovery. When Europeans later wrote Kongo's history, they distorted it completely. They described it as a primitive region awaiting civilization. They erased its diplomatic legacy and Christian statehood. They omitted its embassies, treaties, and international presence. The ambassadors disappeared from textbooks. The letters remained untranslated. The paintings were reclassified as curiosities rather than evidence. But not everything could be erased. The physical proof survived even when the narrative was suppressed. The paintings still hang in Dutch museums. The letters remain preserved in the Vatican and Portuguese archives. The documents waited quietly for centuries. In recent decades, historians began reopening those files. They started translating letters that had never been published. They analyzed portraits previously stripped of political context. They reconstructed timelines that contradicted colonial mythology. What emerged was not a footnote. It was a complete challenge to how modern history had been framed. Those Congolese ambassadors were not symbolic figures. They were active participants in early modern global politics. They engaged Europe using its own legal and religious language. They exposed contradictions Europe preferred to ignore. Every handshake with a European monarch mattered. Every audience with a pope carried moral weight. Every portrait painted with dignity recorded the inconvenient truth. Europe knew Africans were capable of complex governance. Europe knew African states operated within international systems. Europe knew its justifications for slavery were false. And Europe proceeded anyway. The diplomatic mission of the Kingdom of Kongo ultimately failed in its primary goal. The slave trade did not stop. In fact, it accelerated throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. Millions of Africans were forced into brutal systems of bondage. No amount of letters or ambassadors could overcome the economic machine. The profits were too enormous. The incentives were too deeply entrenched. In that sense, the mission failed. But in another sense, it succeeded permanently. It proved that the moral foundation of slavery was a fabrication. It demonstrated that Africans were neither ignorant nor powerless. It exposed colonial ideology as deliberate deception rather than misunderstanding. This is why their story still matters now. We are often taught that Europeans acted from ignorance alone. We are told they simply did not know better. The Congolese ambassadors destroy that comforting illusion. Europe met African diplomats face to face. Europe read African kings' words in its own languages. Europe negotiated with African states as equals. Then Europe chose to forget. So remember António Manuel walking through Rome in silk and gold. Remember King Afonso, the first demanding justice for stolen citizens. Remember Miguel de Castro sitting confidently for Dutch painters. Remember the 40 documented diplomatic missions across 2 centuries. Remember that Europe buried this history because the truth was too expensive. These ambassadors spoke multiple languages and understood international law. They entered halls of power, knowing the risk to their lives. They represented a kingdom being dismantled before their eyes. History rewarded them with silence, but not anymore. We remember, and in remembering them, we reclaim a piece of history that changes everything we thought we knew about Africa, Europe, and the lies that shaped the modern world.